My last question before talking some current events is, let's say that libertarian conservative viewpoint in the 90s. Would you consider yourself a libertarian, a Republican? How do you kind of label yourself if you had to, or put yourself in a box today? And like, did that change over time, or has it always been kind of the same box you would have put yourself in throughout your life?
Yeah, I guess when I was in college, you sort of figure out where your political views are and how you would categorize them. And yeah, I would say I was more on the libertarian end of the spectrum. During, like, let's say the Reagan era, the conservative movement was sort of an uneasy alliance of a few different groups. You had sort of free market types, a la like Milton Friedman. You had social conservatives, and then you had sort of anti-communist, Cold Warrior types. And I guess the group that I identified with the most would have been more on the free market economic side, but I also agree with kind of the Reaganite approach to peace through strength. But in any event, and then, after the Cold War ended, I think the political categories got reshuffled a little bit. And so I would say, my views today have evolved, and they're probably a little bit more in a populist direction. And we can delve more into that.
Yeah, well, explain that a little bit more.
Well, so if you look at what the big political divide is in America, if you actually poll people about their political views, the number one predictor of where someone's going to fall in the political spectrum is whether they have a college degree or not.
Interesting.
And so if you actually look at the views of people who are in the professional class, i.e. people who have a college degree, is radically different than the views, by and large, of the working class, which is people with just, say, a high school education. And that is the fundamental division in this country. Now, it's not universally true. There are plenty of people with a college degree, like me, who have more, let's say, working class views, and then vice versa. So, but by and large, that's the division. And there's a whole host of issues where the professional class is very much out of touch with what the working class thinks. And the political scientist who actually, I think, has developed this the most is a guy named Roy Teixeira, who everyone should really check out his Substack if you're interested in this. But he's been doing work over the last couple of years sort of documenting this and showing the polling and so forth. He is the author back in the early 2002 of a book called The Coming or Democratic Majority, maybe Emerging Democratic Majority, in which he predicted that demographic trends would result in the election of Democratic presidents as far as the eye could see. And he was then pretty much considered a prophet because Obama then got elected in 2008, building the type of coalition that Teixeira describes in his book.
Interesting.
So it's interesting, but lately, over the last couple of years, and Teixeira is a Democrat and wants Democrats to win, he's been warning the party, you've gotten way too far left on sociocultural issues, like, for example, censorship, but as one of many. And the reason is because you stop being a working class party. You are now a professional class party. You cater to the views of professional elites, but you're speaking to yourselves. You're speaking increasingly to an echo chamber because you are out of touch with the rest of the country. And so, for example, he very much predicted something like the election of Glenn Youngkin in Virginia. Remember, this is a state that is pretty much a blue state now, Virginia. Biden won the state by 10 points in 2020, and 1 year later, Youngkin wins by 2 or 3 points, so 12, 13-point swing. Why? On issues like schools, CRT, wanting to provide, putting the parents back in charge and providing kids with a high-quality, non-ideological education. This is the type of issue that really sets off most Americans, but the elites, the professional class, is deeply invested in this idea of CRT. Just to take like one example where there's like a very big class divide on that issue. So Teixeira has been warning about the way in which the Democratic Party, he calls it professional class hegemony, has been co-opted by this professional class. Now, what's happening in the Republican Party is really interesting. The Republican Party is in the process of transforming itself into a working class party, very different than what it has historically been. Historically, the Republican Party was more like a chamber of commerce type of party. Now, what you see with this more populist edge to it is it's trying to appeal to the working class. Now, a lot of people would say it's fake, it's not real, but that's kind of what's in the process of happening. Now, my theory about why there is so much contention and divisiveness in the country, why we all feel the strife, is because if you look at just numbers, something like 37% of the country has a college degree as professional class, 63% is working class. Okay, so the working class has the numbers. In a democracy, their views should prevail.
Yes.
And yet, the elites run every institution, from the prestige media to Hollywood, to Wall Street, to the Fortune 500, to the foundations, the nonprofits, the think tanks, the big, even the big funds. Obviously, those are all run by people with college degrees. And so the professional class hegemony that Teixeira talks about in the Democratic Party also exists across the board in all these institutions. And so by and large, you have this phenomenon of institutions in this country being out of step with what most people believe and trying to push an agenda on them that the rest of the country doesn't support. That is fundamentally the divide and the friction in this country. Now, I think what I've described is just objectively the case of what's going on. You could still be a member of the professional class and still think it's a good thing that the Fortune 500 is pushing woke capitalism, or Twitter is pushing for censorship of ideas they don't like, and so on, and they do. But I think fundamentally this is the tension, is that the leadership of the country, not just the political leadership in Washington, but really much more deeply across the board of all of our institutions, they have views that are out of step with most of the country. And I think how we resolve that tension that's the political issue of our time.
Yeah. One of the things that, as you're talking, immediately jumps to mind is you've probably seen the phrase, the meme of good times create weak men create bad times, right? Bad times create strong men. And when I think about this, there is this like bifurcation, I think economically as well, where we have a country with 45% of Americans have no investable assets. Inflation obviously right now is at a 40-year high. And if you were to talk to that professional class, I think most of the people would say, hey, the last 10, 15 years have been amazing, right? Pretty much since the global financial crisis, like everyone's gotten richer and richer. But at the same time, what we've actually seen is that working class hasn't kind of been along for that ride in the same way. And really, they've actually gone the opposite direction. So you kind of get this widening divide. How much of the economic situation plays into some of these thought processes and the transitions between the way that the political, kind of parties are actually transitioning? Is that a fair way to
I think it plays into it hugely. And I think one of the big issues of the last 20 years is the way that our trade policy basically hollowed out the industrial base of the country. This is the phenomenon of, we brought China into the WTO and we gave them, permanent, basically MFN status. And as a result, we exported millions and millions of sort of middle class, working class jobs where people made things with their hands as opposed to knowledge worker type jobs overseas to China and so forth. That created enormous discontent in the country. And that basically is one of the main reasons why Trump got elected in 2016. Remember, the Democrats thought they had this, what they call the blue wall in the Midwest, the industrial Midwest, the Rust Belt. And
fell apart.
It fell apart. Trump absolutely shattered that wall. And one of the main ways he did it was appealing to the fact that really bipartisan trade policy over the last 20 years destroyed these factory towns all over the Midwest. Now, I think that when you lose an election to a total political novice and outsider who has so many characteristics that you would think would be disqualifying, that the elite would basically start having second thoughts and asking itself tougher questions about the way they've been ruling the country. And yet they haven't. I mean, the reaction to 2016 basically was this hysteria, this TDS. And again, I'm not like in saying this trying to advocate for Trump or something. I'm just advocating for when you lose an election, you need to have some sense of introspection and asking why that happened and how your policies might have contributed to it. I mean, the other big issue that Trump ran on were all these stupid wars that America has gotten itself into over the last 20 years. And remember, this was a critique as much of the Republican Party as the Democratic Party. Remember when Trump said no more Bushes? What he meant was no more stupid wars in the Middle East. We got ourselves into Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, Libya. We spent over $6 trillion on nation building in the Middle East. And what do we have to show for it? Nothing. They just hate us even more. The problem is worse in all of these countries. Afghanistan is back in the hands of the Taliban. Iraq is basically now an Iranian proxy state. Libya is in chaos and civil war. Syria, Assad's still running it. So all these efforts were for naught. But I think they, along with our trade policy, created tremendous discontent in the country. Imagine if we had spent that $6 trillion back here at home fixing some of the problems you're talking about. Maybe we wouldn't be at each other's throats quite so much as we are today. Mm-hmm. So you had these huge issues in the country over which discontent was bubbling over. And instead of basically holding itself accountable, the elites of the country, and it's really, again, bipartisan elites who set these policies for 2 decades, rather than having any introspection, they blamed the election on like Russian disinformation, that somehow the Russians caused Trump to be elected, or somehow the country was shot through with white supremacy. That was the reason Trump got elected. They never were willing to look in the mirror and understand the real causes. And what's happened since 2016 is that these mythologies have really only grown. And so this is now what basically somehow has morphed into this censorship crusade where, it started with this idea that somehow the Russians were responsible for Trump's election rather than these deep-seated issues in the country. And that has now blossomed and grown into this full-fledged this sort of content moderation movement in which we're going to take down and censor anything we consider to be disinformation, which is basically anything that the elites running Twitter think is an idea they disagree with.